Chapter 17. June 1910. Clara hung back as the boats came in. She felt shy around the herring girls with their confident demeanours. The girls were as strong as any man, heaving creels on their backs and carrying them to the salting house with ease. Heads bobbed up and down with synchronicity as they reached for the herring, skillfully gutting them with their sharp knives before placing them in barrels. Hands blurred with speed, and the low rate of injury among them amazed Clara. A girl spotted Clara and beckoned her over. Clara looked behind her, but she was alone. She jumped from the wall and made her way into the yard. The woman who had beckoned eyed her up, hands on her hips. "Are ye going to sit watching, or will ye lend a hand?" "Oh, I've never worked with herring before." The women around the table laughed, and an older woman spoke up. "Ye have to start somewhere, lass. Come stand by me and I'll show ye the ropes." Clara moved to the far side of the table. The girls chatted in their native tongue, while the old woman grabbed a rag, bound Clara's fingers and handed her a knife. "Luke." She instructed and gutted a small fish slowly, so Clara could grasp the technique. Clara held her knife with care and mirrored her mentor's actions. "Good lass. Try another one." Clara picked up a larger fish and repeated the motion. "Aye, you're ready," said the woman, and turned back to the table. With slippery fish after slippery fish, Clara tried to keep pace with the other women. Their hands flew as hers stumbled, but they pretended not to notice. At one point, confidence overtook her, and she sliced her hand rather than the fish, leaving a gash that oozed red, much like the guts she'd been handling. "Come here, lass," said the old woman, bandaging her hand to stem the flow of blood. "Careful ye don't get salt in it, or you'll be screaming and howling the rest of the day." The other women nodded agreement at her sage words, all the while continuing their work. The wound stung as though burnt by hot coals, but Clara suffered in silence, unwilling to lose face amongst these women she so admired. She kept her head down, working hard to earn the women's respect. "Clara, you joining the herring lassies?" Jimmy was leaning against the wall of the yard, grinning in amusement. "Aye, I am," Clara called back. Her face reddened as the other women gave sly glances across the table. Jimmy moved away, and one of the younger girls grinned at her. "That your young man?" "No," said Clara, keeping her head down as her cheeks burned. "That's grand." "Why?" "A handsome fellow like that. I fancy me chances at the next dance, that's why." All the women laughed, except Clara, who experienced a surprising stab of jealousy. Within a few days, the herring girls had adopted Clara as one of their own. They offered to pay her a small share of their earnings, and when Clara asked, Anna let her join them. "I assumed you'd be starting work there next year anyway, so this will be good training for you," she said. "You're growing up fast, my love." Anna pulled Clara onto her lap, despite Clara now being as tall as she was. During those sweet summer months, Clara learned to work hard and play hard. The herring girls were a cheerful bunch, always full of joy and song, despite the hard nature of their work. With the final few fish packed away in the cooper's barrels, Clara would accompany them back to their dorms, delighting in their companionship. They talked of their homes far away in the highlands and islands, of men they had left behind, and freedom afforded them thanks to the silver darlings. Tales of romance left her blushing. She learned more in 3 months than she had in the previous 15 years. Her new friends questioned her about Jimmy, but Clara kept quiet. He meant too much to her to be the subject of gossip, and besides, since they'd both been working the herring, there was nothing to tell. On some occasions, the girls would forget themselves and revert to the languages of their homeland. Clara dismissed their apologies. She loved the lilting song-like way they spoke, and knew it wasn't a deliberate exclusion. The months flew by, and soon the season would be over. Clara felt a pang of sadness at her friend's imminent departure. "Ye should come with us, Clara," her friend Kitty suggested one day. "What an adventure we'd have!" It was tempting, but as much fun as she knew it would be, Clara would not leave her island for anyone. "Maybe next year," she offered, knowing she'd no more join them then. "Aye, right. "Whatever ye say," said Kitty, nudging her. The day they left, Clara rushed to the yard to say goodbye. After hugs and kisses, she ran beside the cart until it reached the sands. Her new friends disappeared across to the mainland, waving until they were out of view. She would count the days until next season, and all would be well. Chapter 18. September 1910. Island life returned to normal, income as a distant memory. News spread that Sally Watson was to marry Robert from the Mary Lou. Clara couldn't understand why anyone would marry Robert. On the few occasions they met, Clara thought Robert vulgar, arrogant, and not at all clever. She read about love and marrying princes, but knew Robert was no prince. His thin greasy hair hung in a side parting on his too small head. Pock marks covered his face, and his pot belly sat oddly on his otherwise thin physique. But Clara was as excited as the rest of the island. It was 5 years since the last island wedding, and Clara remembered it as a wonderful celebration. A floral scent and excited atmosphere replaced the depressing mood and stale air of Jimmy's cottage. Flowers lay on the scuffed wooden table. Sally stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by her sisters, some pinning her hair while others tried to squeeze her into Rose's old wedding dress. Sally had the same round figure as Rose, but there was no hiding her swollen breasts and distended belly. Rose was red in the face, fussing round her eldest daughter and shouting at the younger bairns to stop getting under her feet. "Jimmy," she barked, "take those flowers down to the church and tie them onto pews." Jimmy, relieved to escape the gaggle of females, gathered up an armful of flowers, slipped a ball of string into his pocket and made his way to the church. Clara and Anna entered through the church porch and found Jimmy struggling to tie flowers to the pews. "Do you need some help?" "Aye, that would be wonderful," said Jimmy, handing Anna both flowers and string. Clara and Jimmy looked on as Anna selected flowers. She drew them into neat bundles and tied them to the pews, knotting bows in the string and putting Jimmy's attempts to shame. "Why are ye here so early?" "We're singing in the choir," said Clara. She motioned to the small group of islanders by the pulpit, scanning hymn sheets and talking in excited whispers. "How's Sally?" "Aye, she's right enough, if she can ever fit that bloomin' bump into her dress," Jimmy winked, and Clara blushed. Sally had been the subject of island gossip for months, ever since old John interrupted her and Robert. The old man got quite the shock when he'd gone to put away some nets in his shed and found it occupied by 2 young lovers, naked and panting on his workbench. Island gossip claimed he had to lie down with chest pains for several hours after, and his wife had been none too pleased when she discovered why her husband had come over so queer. In the Fisherman's Arms, Alex had beaten Robert black and blue. Clara had pitied Robert when she saw him limping through the village, with an arm in a sling and 2 black eyes. Since then, prying eyes watched the seams of Sally's dress stretch, waiting for news of the inevitable wedding. Once the couple was engaged, Alex accepted the situation. He let Robert resume his work on the Mary Lou, announcing to all who would listen how proud he was of his soon-to-be son-in-law. One night, blind drunk, he stood yelling into the night sky that Robert was the son he'd never had. Rather him than me, thought Jimmy. Perhaps he would no longer have to intercept the day's earnings, or steer his dower away from a pint of ale if there was a new son around. Where will they live? With us to begin with. Jimmy shook his head at the thought of another 2, soon to be 3 bodies filling up the tiny cottage. I might sleep on the boat. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but she couldn't tell if he was serious. I'd best get back to the madhouse. I'm sure there's some errand they'll want me for. See you later? Aye, can't wait. Back at the cottage, Jimmy found a scene of utter chaos. His youngest sisters were running round, doing their best to avoid Rose, who was chasing them with a wet rag to get the grime off their faces. Help me, will ye, Jimmy? She called, catching Marnie by the hem of her skirt and pulling her towards the table. Jimmy reached round and took both child and rag from Rose. With Marnie on his knee, he wiped the cloth over her round cheeks and smooth forehead. See, Marnie, being clean isn't that bad, is it?" She turned to him and pouted, but didn't disagree. "Ye'll look so bonny with flowers in your hair. Do you want me to put them in for ye?" "Aye," she said, sitting still on Jimmy's lap as he combed his fingers through her thick golden curls. He tied a piece of ribbon around her head and tucked flowers into it from ear to ear. "Ye look beautiful," he said, kissing her on her cheek and lifting her off his lap. He turned her round so she was looking at him. "Marnie," he said in a voice so serious that his sister stood stock still, "don't ye dare be getting dirty again." She giggled and ran off, leaving Jimmy to wonder how many flowers would be in her hair by the time they reached the church. Jimmy looked up as Alex walked in from the yard. He'd been smoking a pipe and doing his best to avoid the commotion inside the cottage. Jimmy did a double take. Alex had borrowed a suit from somewhere, his face shaven with clean hair combed in a side parting. His suit hung over his scrawny body, but he looked presentable. He could almost have passed for an average dad rather than the monster Jimmy knew him to be. Father and son nodded at one another and sat in the small room, each uncomfortable with their proximity to the other, but putting old battles aside just for one day. The crowd of females surrounding Sally parted, and she turned to face them. Alex let out a low whistle. She looked radiant. Excitement flushed her cheeks, and the small lace veil brushed against her ivory-clad shoulders. The dress was straining at her rounded middle, but didn't detract from the overall effect. "What are yous two gawping at? We need to get to the church," said Rose, but Jimmy noticed even she had turned and dabbed her eyes with a hanky. Alex offered his hooked arm to Sally, and they led the family outside. The island streets were quiet, all the villagers having gathered in the church. As they approached the parish church, Sally and Alex hung back, allowing the rest of the family to find their seats. St. Mary's Church was as full as a midnight mass. Jimmy nodded to the smiling faces as they made their way along the aisle. He shuddered at the sight of Robert standing puffed-chested near the altar. Even so, the atmosphere in the church was infectious, and Jimmy smiled as he helped his younger sisters up onto the old wooden pews. Clara stood with the rest of the choir members, and as they struck up in song, she had a first-class view of the bride walking down the long aisle. Sally was too much like Rose for Clara's liking, but she swelled with happiness at the sight of the young girl smiling as she stepped towards her new life. The choir took their seats, and Clara watched the ceremony, daydreaming about her own wedding day, which she decided would not be to anyone like Robert. As Reverend Barnes declared the marriage, church bells rang out, and the congregation made their way into the churchyard to watch the ancient customs that every island bride and groom must adhere to. Robert led his wife to the churchyard gates, where old John was waiting, hand outstretched. The groom reached into his pocket and handed the toll to old John, who let the couple through. Beyond the churchyard, local men lined up, forming an arch with their rifles for the young couple to pass through. Robert and Sally clapped their hands over their ears as the sound of gunshots filled the still air, and they ran laughing through to safety. After passing the men and their guns, Clara noticed Sally cup a protective hand around her swollen belly and wondered what it felt like to have a barren growing inside you. Old John and Alex flanked Sally on either side, taking her hands and helping her jump over the petting stone. Raucous cheers came from the assembled crowd. The islanders followed the young couple through the village and stopped outside the hall, where two of Jimmy's sisters appeared from the crowd, carrying plates of wedding cake. They threw the cake, plate and all, over Sally's head, smashing it on the ground behind her. With a cheer, people scrambled to get inside the hall. Clara hung back with Anna and waited for the crowds to disperse a little. "Was your wedding like this?" "In some ways," said Anna, gazing into the distance. Anna took Clara's hand and they sat down on the grass. "It was the happiest day of my life. Also the most terrifying." She smiled at Clara, squeezing her hand. "Why were you scared, ma'am? Didn't you want to marry Dad?" "I wanted to marry your dad more than anything in the world, Clara. It was the islanders who scared me. They weren't keen on me living here, taking the place of a local girl, and goodness me, there were many you Dad could have chosen. Oh, and all those traditions. I thought I'd trip on the petting stone, or worse, get hit by a stray bullet. Clara leant into Anna, who wrapped an arm round her. Did you have a big party after? Oh no, we went to our cottage and people came round for tea and cake. Speaking of parties, shall we go in and enjoy ourselves? The small hall was abuzz with excitement. Each of the landlords from the 9 village pubs had brought several barrels along, and the beer was flowing. In the corner, a small group of musicians were setting up their instruments, and colourful bunches of flowers and bunting adorned the walls. Clara and Anna joined Bill, and the 3 walked over to congratulate the Watsons. Rose was far more jovial with a jug of ale in her hand, smiling and swaying to the music. Bill moved to shake hands with Alex, but already a few pints in, he struggled to attach his hand to Bill's. Sally beamed at well wishers. Robert slunk into a corner, a happy bystander to the festivities. Clara scanned the room and saw Jimmy. He held Marnie in one hand and Ada in the other, swinging them round as the musicians played. The girls' shrieks of delight resounded above the chatter, and soon more people were joining them to dance. Jimmy caught Clara's eye and beckoned her over. "Come and dance with us," he called as she approached their little group. "Aye, all right, I will," she said, removing her 2 tight shoes and throwing them into a corner. They joined hands, and their little circle whirled and spun until they let go, staggering around dizzy. The drinking and dancing continued long into the night. When Alex Watson threw up over the feet of his wife, Anna put a protective arm round Clara's shoulders, guiding her back to the sanctity of their cottage. Chapter 19. December 1911. In its quiet corner of the cold North Sea, the island and its people followed the familiar rhythms and seasons of life. In the spring of 1911, the Watson cottage had welcomed 2 new lives. Within weeks of each other, Sally birthed her first child, and Rose her 10th. In the winter of 1911, another bairn arrived, and the inhabitants of the cottage numbered 16. For a man prone to temper, it was a terrible environment for Alex. There was no way of keeping the bairns from under his feet, and the cramped chaos amplified his anger. With no way to stop him from drinking, Rose encouraged it. His frequent blackouts were her only respite. Passed out by the fire, his fists were still, and his angry mouth quiet. His skin had turned yellow, and his eyes bloodshot. He terrified the bairns, who considered him a real-life monster. The table's wood became a bed, and Rose built a new shelf by which to sit and mend her nets. Whichever way they arranged the cottage, it left no room for Jimmy. He took to sleeping between the boat and the shed, depending on how hard the wind blew. The winter of 1911 was a harsh one. Storms were relentless, and it had been several weeks since the fishermen had taken their boats beyond the safety of the harbour. The entire island felt the pinch. Food was becoming scarce, supplies were running low. Fear bounced off the village buildings and seeped into the homes within. The streets were quiet, bar the howling winds that ripped through them. Even the hardiest of islanders hunkered down behind closed doors. Jimmy shivered beneath his blankets as the wind threatened to tear the shed's tin roof clean off. "Jimmy?" He looked up as lamplight filled the small structure. "Hello? It's me, Bill." "Bill?" said Jimmy, wriggling free of his blankets. "What are ye doing here?" "Didn't like to think of you out in the storm. Come back to mine." "Ta, but I'll be right." A gust of wind rattled the tin roof. "Away with ye, Jim. This is nae time for foolish pride. It's dangerous out here alone. I have a fire gannin." A fire. Now that was tempting. "Anna's cooked broth." Jimmy laughed. All right. I can't turn that down." "Good lad." Jimmy made up his bed, ready for his return. "Bring those with ye," said Bill, pointing to the blankets. "Nae point coming back here tonight." Before Jimmy could argue, Bill retreated into the night and Jimmy followed. Jimmy thought Clara's cottage cosy by day. By night it was even more so. Anna and Clara sat knitting by the fire. Jimmy saw Clara blush as he entered the cottage, but it might have been the warmth of the flames. "Sit here," said Anna, pulling up another chair. Jimmy sat down and held his hands to the flames, feeling returning to them for the first time that evening. His knee bumped against Clara's, and she gave a small jolt. "Sorry," he whispered, but she kept her head down, concentrating on her knitting. "I know something that will warm you up," said Anna. She moved across to an old dresser and pulled out a bottle of gin, filling 4 glasses. Jimmy sipped, welcoming the warmth that spread through his body with each mouthful. The alcohol relaxed Clara. She smiled at Jimmy as Anna thrust a bowl of broth his way. The smile he returned spread more warmth through Clara than any amount of gin. Once she overcame her awkwardness, Clara welcomed Jimmy's company. The past few weeks had been monotonous. Anna made the best of things, filling Clara's time with sewing projects and mending tasks. But Clara hated being trapped indoors, longing to get out with fresh sea air on her skin. They were fortunate compared to most, with driftwood gathered during the warmer months and stores of smoked fish. The small windows of the cottage rattled with ferocious winds, and Bill looked out for any signs of the storm abating. Anna frowned as the familiar patter of rain sounded against the roof tiles. "How long have you been sleeping in the shed, Jimmy?" she asked. "A while," he said, his cheeks turning pink. "I suppose there's not much room in the cottage since the bairns arrived." "There wasn't much room before," he laughed. "No, I don't imagine there was." "You're lucky it's just the 3 of ye in here." "Aye," said Anna. Noticing her sad smile, Jimmy changed the subject. "When do ye reckon the boats will be out again?" he asked Bill. "Dinna know, but it canna come soon enough. Just need this damn wind to die down." Anna was as keen as Bill for the winds to drop. He had been like a caged animal these past weeks, pacing the cottage floors. Eager to get back on the water, he wasn't much fun to have around the home. It didn't look like the weather would clear soon. With no prospect of work the next day, the family stayed up later than usual. By the time they were ready for bed, the gin bottle was empty, and all agreed it had been a most pleasant evening. Anna helped Jimmy lay out his blankets by the fire, and Clara appeared with her patchwork quilt. "Here you go," she said. "This should keep you warm." "Ta," said Jimmy. She handed him the blanket, then reached her arms round him in a quick hug. "Good night." "Sweet dreams," he called as she retreated to her bed. Jimmy snuggled down beside the fire. When he wrapped himself in the quilt, it was as though Clara had her arms around him again. The following morning, Jimmy packed up his blankets, ignoring the family's pleas to stay another night. "He's too proud for his own good," said Bill after Jimmy left. "No, love, he's just had to fend for himself since he was a wee bairn. It's all he knows." "Aye, well, he'll either starve or freeze to death if he stays living in that shed much longer." "He won't accept charity. If you want to help him, think of another way." Bill scratched at his beard and headed out into the yard. It was Mother Nature who provided the answer. The following evening, a monstrous storm attacked the cottage, ripping tiles from the roof and the privy door from its hinges. Jimmy lived through every moment, the shed rattling in protest as howling winds fought against its walls. When Bill appeared, the morning after, he found the shed still standing. "How's this old beast still upright when our cottage is torn to shreds?" he asked, stepping through the door. "Reckon someone's looking down on me," said Jimmy, grinning despite his lack of sleep. "Nothing that can amend, but I could do with some help to fix it up." "Nay, bother. Tell me what you need doing and I'll be there." Bill feigned embarrassment, pulling at his beard, not meeting Jimmy's eye. "Thing is, lad, I canna afford to pay you for your trouble." "I wouldn't take payment if ye offered it me," said Jimmy. "And I would not take free labour if ye offered it me," laughed Bill. "How's about we come to some arrangement?" "Aye, and what's that?" said Jimmy, shrewd enough to know Bill was up to something. "Well, we could pay ye in food and board, once a week at ours." Jimmy shook his head. "I'll accept the occasional bowl of anise broth, but I'm no charity case. I was grateful for your kindness the other night, but I don't expect it to become regular. I can take care of myself." "Fine, but you're to come round once a week for a hot meal. It's nae charity. It's family." "Agreed." "Will there be gin?" Bill laughed. "You'd rather hard bargain, lad." Chapter 20. September 1912. Knee-deep in fish guts, Clara wiped her brow, spreading silver scales across it. "Done for the day!" cried Alice as the cooper came to seal the final barrel. Clara sat down her knife and gathered up her bag. "See ye tomorrow," she called, stepping out of the yard. She didn't mind the work, but missed the company of Kitty and her crew, who had not returned to the island since Clara's first summer in the yard. She'd heard from Alice they had gone to North Shields. More work and more lads. Down at the harbour, she knocked on the door of Jimmy's shed. "I'm up," he called, and Clara let herself inside. Since he moved in, the shed had changed. Fishing gear lay in boxes, the floor was free of debris, and through the clean glass window came a spectacular view of harbour and castle. "Here you go," Clara said, handing him the supper Anna had packed up for him. "Ta." Jimmy had long since given up arguing against the generosity the family showed him. If he didn't accept, they would just leave the food outside the door and it would be the gulls who would benefit. "You out tonight?" "Aye, all signs are good." "Your da coming with you?" "Don't know. He's not shown up all week, so no reason tonight will be different." Must be hard being a man down." Jimmy laughed. "It's a whole sight easier, I can tell ye." In fact, Jimmy breathed a sigh of relief each time the Mary Lou set out from harbour without her skipper on board. It was only Robert who missed Alex. Unwilling to take orders from Jimmy, who became skipper by default in his dad's absence. To Jimmy's dismay, that evening Alex graced them with his presence. His face was the colour of fine sand. "Nae natural," muttered one of the crew, shocked at the skipper's appearance. Alex barked out instructions, and the Mary Lou made her way out to sea. Not 5 miles out, Alex ordered them to shoot the nets. The choppy green water below showed no traces of silver, and gulls were absent from the sky above. "Ye sure, da?" asked Jimmy. "What did ye say to me, lad?" "I said, are ye sure? There's no sign silver darlings are about these waters. How about we go south of the Staples?" "Who's skipper of the Mary Lou?" Alex asked Robert. "Ye are da," said Robert. So now Robert was calling Alex da, was he? Well, thought Jimmy, he's welcome to him. Without further comment, Jimmy headed to the gunwale and began shooting the nets. The crew eyed Jimmy. His silence spoke volumes, and all regretted Alex's presence on board. Once they shot the nets, the men settled down for some scran. "What yer get in that fancy tin of yours?" called Alex. Jimmy looked down at the food packed by Anna. He picked up an oatcake, held it up to his da, and popped it in his mouth. "Someone's get them selling you, mammy," laughed Alex. He looked around at the crew, but no one joined in his laughter. Even Robert avoided Alex's eyes, as nervous as the next man at the tension between father and son. Jimmy ate, then closed his eyes, eager to avoid the confrontation Alex was angling for. Before dawn, he woke to see Alex leaning over the edge of the boat, staring into the water below. When Alex looked up, there was a murderous look in his eyes. Jimmy crossed the boat to find the cause of his distress. Corks bobbed on the water. Buffs sat on its surface. The crew joined them and glanced at Alex. The skipper straightened himself up and stared hard at Jimmy. "'Tis down to yer blethering that these lads'll gan hungry." "What?" said Jimmy. "It was ye that told us to shoot the nets. Ye that wouldn't go further." Alex sauntered over to his son. The other men held their breath. "Think ye now better, do ye? Always thought ye above the rest of us. I'm skipper here." "Aye, ye are when you're not holed up somewhere sleeping off the drink." From the look in Alex's eyes, Jimmy knew he had gone too far. He didn't notice the fist as it flew, but felt it crunch against his nose. He staggered backwards, pinching hard to stem the flow of blood. Before he could get his balance, Alex was on him again, gripping him by the neck and pushing him hard against the gunwale. Of the two, Jimmy was stronger, but his foot had caught in a net, and with Alex pushed against him, he couldn't free himself. Stars filled his vision as Alex squeezed his throat tighter. In an instant, Alex released his grip, grabbed Jimmy's leg, and heaved him overboard. As Jimmy fell, 10 faces, white with shock, stared down at him. Before he hit the water, he heard Alex call, "Leave him!" Jimmy hit the water with such a force he wondered if it had torn the skin from his back. The cold shocked him, and for a moment he fell motionless, deeper and deeper into the murky depths. Terrified by the ever-growing darkness around him, he kicked his foot free of the net and began pulling himself up through the water. His Gansey and sou'wester weighed him down, but he drew on all the strength he had. As his head emerged, it met with the crest of a wave that sent him spinning within its frothy strength. His face met the sky, and he gasped in lungfuls of air. The Mary Lou had her sails up and was turning back to harbour. "Help!" he yelled. "Help!" Alex's face appeared above the stern. The boat didn't turn. Jimmy spun round in the water, legs kicking to stop him from sinking. In the distance were the red-brown sails of another vessel. Hope. He battled the water's angry peaks and troughs to stay afloat. The yellow sleeves of his sou'wester acted as a beacon, and the vessel made her way closer to Jimmy. "Man overboard!" someone shouted, the rope they threw slapping the water beside him. Jimmy gripped it, and they winched him from the freezing sea. Strong arms grabbed him, and he collapsed into the hull, the eyes of 1,000 silver darlings staring up at him. Bill's face appeared above him, and soon he was being pulled out of his wet clothes. The crew were removing layers of their own clothes, and soon they'd bundled Jimmy up so tight he couldn't move. Despite the layers, he couldn't stop shivering. He curled up in a corner, shaking. The boat raced for harbour, and on reaching land, 4 burly men heaved Jimmy ashore. "Can he stand?" asked Bill. "Aye, I think so," said Jimmy, trying to get up. His head spun, and he collapsed against Bill, who put a large arm around him, holding him steady. Bill half-carried Jimmy back to his own cottage. A stunned Anna made space by the fire. As Clara came in from the yard, the sight of Jimmy, grey-faced, greeted her. He sat shivering despite the warmth of the flames. Bill shook his head as she went to speak. "Some tea, please, Clara," he said. Once he was sure Jimmy was all right, Bill retreated from the cottage. He appeared several hours later, knuckles bruised and bleeding. Neither Anna nor Clara needed to ask where he had been. Chapter 21. October 1912. Clara was grateful for her woolen stockings and jacket as she set off towards the castle. It was rare for her to have a spare couple of hours. Autumn was slipping into winter. The few trees that dotted the barren landscape, bent with the relentless island winds, were shedding their leaves and the nights were drawing in. For the first time in a week, there had been a break in the weather. Her irritability at being cooped up inside had not gone unnoticed by her parents. The sky was an ominous shade of grey, but Anna had insisted Clara get some fresh air in her lungs, and she had been more than happy to escape the confines of the cottage. She skipped along the stone path, delighted to be out in the open air. At the castle, she turned and headed toward the north shore. Her favourite place on the island, she could gaze out at nothingness, letting its peace wash over her. She made her way down onto the beach and followed the line of the tide as the coast curled around, like a piece of rope, leading her towards her destination. It wasn't the easiest route. Clara had to clamber over rocks, and at some parts of the journey, the beach disappeared, forcing her up onto grassy dunes. The closer she got to the north shore, the more even her path became, the rocky outcrops giving way to pebbles and fine grains of sand. As her boots scuffed the sand, she noticed someone tumbling down the dunes, removing their shoes and running straight into the icy water. Clara hesitated, but as the figure let out a loud cry, she recognised the voice and increased her pace. Jimmy walked through farmland until he reached the rolling dunes. Sand swirled around him, whipped up by the wind and stinging at his face. He tugged his collar up and his hat down round his ears. Here he was free from the village, free from realities of life. He reached the top of a large dune and stopped to take in the view. Before him lay a vast expanse of steely grey sea. The sky was watery blue, with only the faintest wisps of cloud. Gulls gliding on gusts of wind. Sharp-edged rocks jutted into the water, and seals of all shades of grey lay on ragged outcrops. Jimmy let out a cry and hurled himself down the sandbank towards the beach. Halfway down, he lost his footing, landing in a sandy heap. He lay there for a few moments, before standing up and dusting off the sand that now covered his clothes. The inside of his boots were like sandcastles, and as he emptied them, his feet sank into freezing sand. A chill swept through his body, and he glanced at the water. It looked inviting, but Jimmy knew how cold it would be. Before he could talk himself out of it, he was running to the water's edge. As his feet submerged beneath the water, he yelped, hopping from one foot to another. He stayed in the water for less than a minute before the pain became unbearable and he rushed to find his woolly socks. By the time he'd secured the laces of his boots, his feet were numb. Jimmy caught sight of a figure looking at him across the beach. He squinted against the sun, but despite shielding the light with his hand, he could not make them out. Clara waved her hand in a wide swoop across the sky. "Jimmy!" she called. "Jimmy!" He was staring, hand to his forehead. "Jimmy!" she called once more, moving closer. This time he heard and waved his arm in a mirror image of her own. He was grinning by the time she caught him up. "What are you doing out here?" "Escaping," he said. "You heading back?" "I was going to. But I can walk some more if you like." "Aye, I would." They walked along the north shore, conversation flowing as they followed the coastline round towards the Snook. Beyond the headland, the mainland came into view, shades of purple and brown sweeping the horizon like strokes from an artist's brush. Jimmy paused. "You all right?" "Aye," said Jimmy, but he continued to stare out across the water to the gentle curves of land beyond. "Jimmy." He pulled his gaze from the view and shuffled towards her. He took her hands in his and looked deep into her eyes, sending heat coursing through her body despite the cold of the day. "Clara." He seemed to struggle for words, looking away from her but keeping her hands in his. "I have to go away." "That's all right," she smiled. "I'll walk home with you." "No, I need to go away from the island, just for a while. Maybe for longer." "No." The warmth of moments ago became smothered by a chill. "No." Jimmy let go of her hands and turned away. "You don't understand." Clara walked closer to him. "Help me understand." She took hold of his hand and pulled him down, till they were sitting side by side on the cold, damp sand. In Clara's presence, Jimmy found a sense of peace and certainty that left him clear-headed and sure-footed. "Did your dad tell you what happened that night?" Clara knew what night he meant. It had cast an unspoken shadow that lurked between them every time they met. It showed on Anna's face when she met Rose in the street, and in the clenched fists of Bill every time he saw Alex. "He never said a word, but I guess there was some fight." Jimmy laughed. "A fight I could handle." "Clara, my dad tried to kill me." Clara stared at Jimmy. "You don't mean on purpose?" "As good as. I don't think he planned it, but he was happy enough to leave me to drown. If it weren't for Bill, I'd be at the bottom of the sea by now." "What about your mam?" "She's not spoken to me since. Tried once and he made her suffer for it. I don't think he wants her to know what happened out there." "And Marnie?" "Oh, I see Marnie plenty. She's a sneaky what's it. Comes down to the shed when Da's passed out. I don't see the other bairns." Clara listened, trying her best to understand, while her heart and mind mottled with sadness. "If you stayed, things might get better." Jimmy shook his head. "Nah, Da won't let me on the boat again. The work Bill's thrown my way has helped, but I can't keep scrounging off him forever." "There's no scrounging going on, Jimmy. He'd have you as a full crew member if he had the space. Says you're his best worker." "It's not just fishing, though. The island's so small I can't avoid seeing Da. I'm afraid, Clara." "Afraid of your Da?" "Aye, but worse than that. I'm afraid that I'll become like him, that if I stay here, I will turn hard. Hateful." "Oh, Jimmy, you could never be like him." Jimmy gave a hard laugh. "Aye, I could. Jimmy, Clara, the only way I can be better is if I get as far away as I can. Start a new life. When I'm set up, I can send for Marnie and the other bairns. Give them a good life." "But what about the Mary Lou? Your Da won't be around forever, and it'll be yours one day." "The Mary Lou won't survive another winter, Clara. And besides, Da wants Robert to be skipper when he retires." Clara sat for a moment, deep in thought, empty of any argument to make him stay. "Where will you go?" "I'll follow the silver darlings. There's plenty of money in chasing them, if you're on the right boat." A tear rolled down her cheek. Jimmy's hand reached across to brush it away. "What about me?" she whispered, looking down and digging her fingers into the sand. Jimmy cupped her chin and pulled her face up to meet his eyes. "Clara," he said. His face was inches from her own, twisted with grief, but his eyes were hard and certain. His rough, salty lips gently brushed hers. She whipped her head back and stared at him. Jimmy leaned forward, and his lips met hers, harder and more urgent than before. This time, she sank into him, her arms wrapping themselves around his strong, slim body, his round hers, pulling her closer, closer. The air around Clara became thick. Her senses dimmed until her whole being filled with him. Time stood still, their two bodies moving as one dark shape against the pale silver of the dunes. Their kisses slowed, and Jimmy's hands caressed her face, wiping away wet tears with his thumbs. Clara pulled him down beside her, and they lay entwined against the mound of sand, her head resting on his shoulder, his fingers combing her wind-tangled hair. "Clara." She said, nuzzling into his chest. "Will ye wait for me?" She lifted her head and looked down into his face, taut with hope. "Aye, Jimmy, I'll wait for you." She placed her head back down, the beating of his heart against her cheek. He kissed the top of her head, and she smiled. Jimmy began talking, growing quick and excited as he imagined their future. "It will take a while to set myself up, but once I'm settled with some money behind me, I'll send for ye." "Send for me?" Clara propped herself up on her elbow, looking down into his eyes. "Aye, I'll make a home for us somewhere new, away from Mam and Da and that damned hovel of a cottage." He smiled at her, but she didn't return the hope in his eyes. "You mean, away from the island?" "Aye," he laughed, but Clara wasn't laughing. Instead, icy fingers were trailing round her heart, tightening and squeezing out the joy that had filled it. "Jimmy, I won't leave my home. I'm an islander." She looked down at him, begging him to understand, but her island was not his, her place within it the antithesis of his own. Jimmy shook his head. "I can't stay here," he said, voice cracking as tears swam in his eyes. They broke apart and sat side by side on the sand, Clara hugging her knees to her chest. "Are you ready to walk home?" asked Jimmy, standing up and offering her a hand. "No, I think I'll stay a while," Clara gave him a weak smile. As Jimmy began walking away, Clara called to him. "Jimmy, when will you go?" "Not before the summer. I'll wait for the silver darlings." And with that, he turned and walked away. Chapter 22. April 1913. Clara flopped down onto her bed, exhausted. Anna had not been herself for months, and Clara had been trying her best to pick up the slack. At almost 17, the expectations placed on her had grown. In the mornings, she would trawl the shoreline looking for driftwood to stoke the fire. Then she would fetch water from the well. Mid-morning, she'd set about baiting the lines and attending to any mending. In the past few weeks, she'd been helping her mam with the cooking and cleaning too, and as spring wore on, she realised it had been weeks since she'd had any time to herself. Clara was loading wood into the store when Anna came carrying a basket of washing to hang on the line. She put the basket down and grabbed a cloth from her pocket to wipe her brow. It worried Clara how pale she was, despite the hours she'd spent working on the nets in the sun. Anna grabbed a sheet from her basket and reached up to peg it to the line. As she did so, her full skirt fell against her stomach. Clara gasped at the protruding round bump, hidden by swathes of cotton. "Ma'am!" Clara rushed over and placed her hand on her belly. Anna looked at Clara with alarm and took her hand. "Come with me." She led Clara back inside the cottage and poured them each a glass of water from the jug that stood on the table. Anna stared at the surface of the table, unable to speak. "Ma'am, are you having a bairn?" Anna looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes. "I don't know." "But the bump," said Clara, pointing at her belly as she spoke. "Have you ever wondered why you don't have any brothers or sisters?" It was something Clara often wondered and felt the stab of jealousy as her friends played with their siblings. But with her mam so fragile, she kept her thoughts to herself. "No," Clara lied. "I've always been happy with you and Dad. You're old enough now to understand the ways of the world, and it's time I told you the truth. There have been many times since we had you, we thought we were going to bring another child into the world. But... Tears began rolling down her cheeks. She took a deep breath and in a whisper added, "But nature had other ideas." Clara understood what she was telling her, and a lump formed in her throat. "But this baby, is this one going to be all right?" Anna reached down and began stroking her swollen stomach. "I hope so, but babies should wriggle and jiggle. That's what you did. This one, though, he's still. I haven't felt him move in 2 weeks." Her face fell, and she buried it in her hands, large sobs escaping from beneath them. Clara got up and wrapped her arms around her. She had missed what was right under her nose and felt childish. Once Anna's sobs lessened, Clara got up, filled the kettle and hung it over the fire. She held her mam as she waited for the water to boil. The kettle whistled, and Clara made tea and set it down on the table. Anna lifted her head and took the cup, her hands shaking. As Anna drank, Clara picked up a broken line and set about mending. She didn't want to tempt fate by admitting how excited she was at the prospect of a sibling, and they sat quietly, Anna picking up the line and working side by side with Clara. Over the next few weeks, Clara cast furtive glances towards Anna whenever she could, checking for signs of colour returning to her cheeks or the movement of her belly. But she saw neither. Clara woke one night to the sound of screaming. The noise ripped through the flimsy curtains separating the room, startling her into consciousness and action. She drew the curtain back and saw her dad kneeling beside his wife, ashen-faced and gripping onto her hands. Anna was writhing in pain, sweat on her brow and her face twisted in agony.
"Clara, fetch Mrs. Crow."
Clara pulled the blanket from her bed, wrapped it around herself, and slipped her feet into her boots. In less than a minute, she was out of the door and running down the lane to Mrs. Crow's house. Mrs. Crow had trained as a nurse in her youth and was the closest the islanders had to a doctor. Clara hammered on Mrs. Crow's door for an age before slow shuffling footsteps made their way towards her. The door opened a crack and Mrs. Crow peered out. One look at Clara's face told her all she needed. She turned, calling over her shoulder, "I'll get me bag, pet." She returned with a leather bag in hand and pulled on her coat with one hand, closing the door behind her with the other. Clara wanted to run, but Mrs. Crow was old and her steps slow. As they neared the cottage, Clara ran ahead, bursting through the door and rushing to her mam's side. "She's coming," Clara said, and Bill nodded his reply. She saw her mam turn from ashen white to grey. Her breathing laboured, the silence of the cottage punctured by the piercing cries that came every couple of minutes. Mrs. Crow arrived, panting at the cottage door. "Put some water on to boil, pet." She went to Anna, touching her forehead and holding her wrist to check her pulse. Clara turned to fill the kettle, but as she looked back, Mrs. Crow lifted the blanket that was covering Anna. She wished she hadn't looked. The sheets below Anna were deep red, and alarm crossed Mrs. Crow's face as she took in the scene before her. "I'm going to need sheets, blankets, towels, everything you've got," Mrs. Crow ordered. Clara began taking items out of the chest near her parents' bed. "Come on, pet. Hold on in there. It'll be over soon." Mrs. Crow was stroking Anna's hair, but her eyes were glazed and she appeared not to hear. A scream ripped through the cottage and Mrs. Crow was lifting the blanket again. "All right, pet. The bairn's coming now. Ye need to push." Clara looked at her mam's fragile frame and wondered if she would have the strength required. But in that moment, something primal took over. Her eyes cleared, and she grunted, pushing down against the edge of the bed and letting out another piercing scream. Something slimy and grey slipped into the arms of Mrs. Crow. For the first time, Bill spoke. "Is that the bairn? Is he all right?" His eyes switched from hope to devastation as Mrs. Crow shook her head and wrapped the body of the baby in a blanket, laying him gently against Anna's chest. Anna made no move to hold the baby. Her eyes glazed over once more, and Mrs. Crow shook her shoulder. "Come on, pet, your bairn's here. He needs his mammy to hold him before ye say goodbye." But Anna didn't reach for the baby. Instead, her arms flopped down, hanging listlessly beside the bed. Her head rolled to the side. Anna's eyes were open, but there was none of the usual light that made them sparkle. In fact, Clara saw there was no light at all. The air in the cottage seemed thick, and Clara was struggling to catch a breath. The sounds of the room came from far away, familiar objects, confused and blurred. Clara's body swayed. She heard Bill in the distance. "Nay, nay, nay!" The howl of anguish from Bill faded to silence as Clara slid to the floor. When she came round, she was aware of something cold and wet on her forehead, and Mrs. Crow looking into her eyes. For a blissful moment, Clara forgot where she was. But then the room came back into focus, and she saw her mam lying on the bed, eyes closed, arms folded. Her face was pale. She looked like a doll. Bile rose in her throat. She ran outside to the garden and threw up. With nothing left to expunge from her body, Clara stood, grabbing hold of the wall as her legs gave way beneath her. Once her strength returned, she walked over to a bucket of water and splashed her face. She smoothed down her hair, took a big gulp of fresh sea air, and walked back into the cottage. Bill was weeping beside Anna's bedside. In 16 years, she had never seen him cry. He got up and lay beside Anna on the bed, his head next to hers. Clara noticed her mam was lying on fresh sheets and decided that must have been the work of Mrs. Crow. The old lady was packing items into her leather bag. Clara walked over to thank her. "Oh, pet, there's no need. I couldn't help your mam or the bairn," she said, eyes watery with tears. But Clara's eyes were dry, her body numb. After seeing Mrs. Crow out, she walked across the small room to where Bill and Anna lay, looking as if they had just taken to bed for a cat nap. "Da, do you need anything?" He lay with his eyes closed and didn't respond. She tried again, whispering in case he had fallen asleep. "Da?"
"The one thing I need is the one thing I canna have."
Bill's voice was hoarse. He placed his arm gently across his wife's still body. Clara retreated to her side of the room, drawing the curtain across. Still, no tears would come. She climbed into bed, still wearing her boots. A wave of exhaustion swept through her, and she lay on top of the bedsheets, a blanket wrapped around her, waiting for sleep to come. Her small toy rabbit sat on the cabinet beside her, and she picked it up, hugging it to her. Clara could hear the quiet rhythm of her dad's sobbing. Sleep eluded her. When Bill's sobs turned to gentle snores, Clara got up, crept across the cottage and clicked open the door. Outside, the birds began their dawn chorus, and the sky was no longer black but navy, growing lighter by the minute. She walked to the harbour, then on towards the castle. When she reached it, she began climbing across the rocks that led to the water's edge. Looking out at the open sea, Clara wished it would whisk her away to wherever her mam had gone. Grief welled inside her until it became an uncontrollable force. Clara released a scream that filled the vast sky around her, scattering seabirds into the air and bouncing off the castle walls before heading out to sea. She screamed until her throat stung, and it was then that the tears came. "I want my mammy," she sobbed as she crouched at the water's edge, hugging her arms around herself. "I want my mammy," she screamed at the sea. "I want my mammy," she screamed at the sky. Sinking down against a rock, she cried until her head pounded and her eyes ran dry. She let a hollow sadness invade her body, one that she wondered if she could ever shake. Chapter 23. April 1913. Clara woke to the sound of gulls calling to one another as they glided above her head. Her body clicked and creaked as she straightened herself up from her rocky resting place. She raised her face to the sky, watching the birds floating on air without a care in the world. "Fly me away with you," she wished, but the birds ignored her pleas, ducking and diving as currents moved them around the bright blue. Clara shook her head, free of grief, and began marching towards the village. She couldn't fall apart. She was all Bill had, and must care for him as her mam would have wished. As she passed the harbour, she saw the familiar figure of her da wading out towards his boat. Clara stopped and watched as he leant against its side, unable to pull himself aboard. Even from a distance, she could see the violent movement of his body, as sobs heaved his shoulders up and down. She heard the roar as he cursed fate, cursed God, cursed life. Then, in one quick movement, he was on his boat. He unfurled the sail, sat back and steered the vessel out to sea. A sense of dread filled Clara as she opened the door to the cottage. Inside, she found Mrs. Crow sitting by her mam, now covered in a sheet. Tendrils of auburn hair spilled from its edges, and Clara sat herself beside Anna's body, running the strands of hair between her fingers. Mrs. Crow looked at Clara. "Are ye all right, pet?" Clara didn't know how to answer her. "I will be. Some day," she said. Mrs. Crow nodded in understanding. They sat for a while in silence until Mrs. Crow shifted in her seat and asked Clara if she would mind her returning home. "You go, I'll watch over her," said Clara, motioning to the still shape of her mam. Mrs. Crow gathered up her coat and let herself out of the cottage. Clara lay down on her side and looked at the form of Anna beneath the sheet. She sang to her, barely above a whisper, and with her voice catching as it caught with tears.
Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. So fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry. Till all the seas gang dry, my dear, and the rocks melt with the sun. I will love thee still, my dear, while the sands of life shall run. And fare thee well, my only love, and fare thee well a while, and I will come again, my love, though it were 10,000 miles.
Clara didn't notice the fat tear that slipped off her cheek and soaked into the sheets covering her mam. She didn't know how long she lay there, but she was becoming drowsy when a soft knocking on the door caused her to sit up. "Hello?" The door opened a crack, just wide enough to see the familiar face of Jimmy.
"Is it all right if I come in?"
"Aye." Jimmy came into the room, taking his cap off at the sight of the body laid out on the bed and holding it to his chest. He stood for a moment till Clara motioned him to come and sit beside her.
"I saw your dad down by the harbour. He asked me to check on ye."
"I'm fine," said Clara. Jimmy put an arm around her, and she turned into him, burying her face in his shoulder and soaking his gansy with her tears. The sobbing eased, and she moved away, wiping snot and salty tears with her sleeve. He gently reached up and pushed away a strand of hair that had stuck to her forehead. He didn't speak, but lowered her down onto the bed beside Anna and sat with her until she fell asleep. Clara woke to the sound of the kettle whistling on the stove, and for a moment everything seemed normal. But rubbing sleep from her eyes, there was her mam, still and cold beside her. Jimmy took the kettle off the fire and glanced across.
"Sorry, didn't mean to wake you."
"You came back?"
"Nah, I never left. Promised your dad I'd stay with you, and I don't break my promises."
He looked away, embarrassed, and set about making her tea. Clara raised a hand and rubbed at her throbbing forehead. "How long have I been sleeping?"
"I don't know, but it's morning now, so a good while."
"My dad?" Clara asked, looking anxiously around for any sign he had returned.
"He hasn't been back here yet. Give him some time, Clara. He'll be right."
Clara wanted to believe him, but she knew something had shifted, and without Anna to hold them together, life wouldn't be the same again.
"What happens now?"
"You mean with your mam?"
"Aye. I think she'll stay with yous longer. Then I suppose there'll be a funeral."
"What happens at a funeral?" Clara asked, ignorant of the ways of the world.
"Well, at my granddad's there were hymns. The vicar read from the Bible, then we buried Grandad in the churchyard. A few people came back to the cottage, telling stories about him and such like."
"Oh," said Clara. The thought of Anna being buried beneath the island soil horrified her. But it would happen, and in some ways she wished it would happen sooner rather than later. All the while Anna's body lay in the cottage, Clara felt she wouldn't be able to breathe. Jimmy stayed a while longer, until they heard Marnie out on the street calling his name.
"Better get going," he said,
reluctant to leave her until he was sure she'd be all right.
"Thank you, Jimmy. I'll be fine here."
Clara waited for Bill to return, but day turned to night and back to day, and still he wasn't home. Jimmy called by in the evening to let her know that he'd seen Bill out on his boat and he wasn't showing any signs of returning to the harbour. By the following afternoon, Clara was pacing the length of her cottage. She had lost her mam. She couldn't lose her dad too. As dusk was settling in, Bill finally walked through the door. "Where have you been?" Clara shouted, full of rage that he should leave her to deal with this alone. "Oot," he said, keeping his head down and not looking at her. "What about mam?" "What about her? She's gone. Now we can do for her now." "Aye, there is. We need to sort a funeral." "I've been to the vicar. It's happening tomorrow." In the event, the funeral passed by in a blur of grief. The entire island turned out, plenty crying, not just the women. Kindly arms patted Clara and Bill, people speaking words of condolences that merged into one long expression of sympathy. There was no wake afterwards. Instead, Bill went out on his boat and left Clara alone. Clara lost both parents the day Anna died. In the weeks that followed, she searched desperately for signs her kind-hearted dad had returned. Bill had barely uttered 2 words to her since the funeral, spending his time either at sea or at the Crown Inn, only returning to the cottage to sleep. He could no longer look at his daughter, and it hurt her almost as much as Anna's death. Clara gave him a grace period of 3 weeks before confronting him. "I'm still here, Dad. Why won't you talk to me? Why won't you look at me?" she asked one night after he'd stumbled home from a drinking session. Bill ignored her, but she wasn't prepared to let him this time. "Da? Da!" she screamed, pushing in front of him, standing inches from his face. Clara didn't see his hand, but felt the hot sting of his palm against her cheek. She bent double, hand to her face, stumbling across the room and cowering in a corner. Bill moved towards her, but as she flinched, he backed away. Sitting beside the fire, he put his head in his hands. Clara wasn't sure how long they stayed like that. After a while, pins and needles crept up her legs, and she inched her way up to standing. She edged across the room, but stopped short at the sound of his voice. "You're too much like her, Clara," he said through the muzzle of his hands. "What do you mean?" This time his voice was louder. "You remind me of her, Clara." "Isn't that a good thing?" Clara jumped as Bill slammed his fist down onto the table. "Nay, it isn't." Not wanting to anger him further, Clara crept through to the bedroom and buried herself under her blankets. Chapter 24. June 1913. A month had passed since their altercation, yet father and daughter were no closer to being reconciled. Clara cooked Bill's meals and took care of the household tasks Anna had attended to, hoping this might break the hard casing that now surrounded his heart. It was all to no avail. He ate in silence and spent most of his time away from home. It seemed the ghost of the cottage was Clara, for Bill looked right through her. One evening he didn't return home, and Clara sought him out. She tried the Crown first, peering through its grimy windows until old John came out and informed her Bill was not there. She called at all the island pubs, but Bill was in none. Frustrated, Clara began roaming the island paths and was coming down from the Hugh when she caught sight of him. He was talking to Rachel Watson. Clara could think of no reason for Bill to talk to Jimmy's sister and moved to join them. As she descended the rocky slope, Clara glanced up and noticed an intimacy to their movements. She hung back. Bill held Rachel's hand. Perhaps as a comfort? Instinct told her not to interrupt. They walked away and Clara followed at a distance. As they neared her cottage, she expected them to part ways, but they continued. She watched as they entered the Watson cottage and closed the door behind them. Clara was waiting at the kitchen table when Bill returned. He looked surprised to see her, but hung his jacket and made to go to his bed. "Da, where have you been?" she asked, stopping him in his tracks. "Doing the pub." "No, you haven't. You were with Rachel Watson." Bill spun round.
What business is it of yours who I've been with? Clara slunk into her chair. Da, she said. Her broken voice caught him off guard. For a moment, she noticed kindness returned to his eyes and longed to wrap her arms around him. He sat opposite her at the table. Rachel and I are to marry. What? Why? I need a wife. I need a son. He pushed back his chair, signalling that the conversation was over. Clara watched speechless as he retreated to the bedroom. Anger bubbled up inside her. She was no longer a child who would follow demands without question. She marched through to the bedroom and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, head in his hands. How could you? I have to, Clara. I need a son. I told you. She's only a little older than me, Clara screamed, wanting to shake him from his madness. Bill looked up, and even in her emotional state, Clara could see that the hardness had returned to his eyes. It's settled, he said, and turned his back on her. Clara could not bear to be near him. She returned to the kitchen, grabbed an armful of blankets from the chest, and slammed the door. She ran to the harbour, anger spurring her on. The harbour was pitch black. The dark of the night and lapping of waves brought a calmness that quietened her soul. She picked her way over small rocks until she reached the fishermen's sheds. Jimmy, she whispered. Clara? His voice was full of sleep, and she was sorry she had disturbed him. Can I sleep here tonight? She asked, stepping into the shed. What's happened? Don't you know? Know what? About Dar and Rachel. They're getting married. Jimmy laughed. You're having me on. Why are you really here? He sat up and tried to judge her expression, but it was impossible in the moonless night. I'm not messing around. I saw them together. He admitted it. Jimmy was now wide awake. Come here, he said. Clara fumbled her way through the darkness to where he lay. He reached for her hand and guided her down beside him. Tell me everything. Clara told him everything she knew, which wasn't much. Poor Bill, said Jimmy. Poor Bill. There's nothing poor about our Bill. He's been a brute since Mam died. He's barely spoken a word to me. Now he's caught in a lassie half his age. Marrying a lassie half his age. Aye, I'll admit that's peculiar. But really, Clara, he's not in his right mind. I lost her too, and I'm not going round acting a fool. Jimmy pulled Clara close, and she leant her head against his shoulder. Try to get some sleep. Things will feel better in the morning. Clara snuggled down beside him and curled up in his arms. Good night, he said, kissing her hair. Proximity to Jimmy was a comfort, but Clara's mind churned over Bill's announcement, and sleep eluded her. He had betrayed both her and Anna. She could never forgive him. Careful not to wake Jimmy, she sat up and made her way through the shed until she felt the cool night air on her face. Up and down the harbour side she paced, tripping and stumbling on rocks, cursing when her arm grazed as she fell. Clara hurled stones into the water, the gentle plop as they landed doing nothing to salve her broken heart. She began feeling around the ground, gathering large rocks in haste, filling the makeshift basket off her skirt before marching over to her father's shed. With a loud cry of despair, she hurled the rocks, hearing them bang against the wooden walls, which she hoped would dent. A satisfying splintering rang out as a rock hit the small glass window. What are ye doing? Cried Jimmy, woken by the sound of breaking glass. He pulled Clara's arm back as she went to throw another rock. This won't solve anything. Maybe not, but it's made me feel better. She managed a small smile and sank down on the grass, some of her rage abating. Cold air pinched at her skin, and she let Jimmy guide her back to his shed without protest. The wedding was a muted affair. They honoured all the traditions, the petting stone, the guns, the gate toll.
What was missing was joy. Bill went through the motions, but didn't once look at his bride as he spoke his vows. He trained his eyes on the floor, and there was an unmistakable crack in his voice. Clara closed her eyes, longing for the day to pass. There was no big island celebration. Clara was the only one sitting on Bill's side of the church, and although Jimmy's large family filled the pews to her right, the church felt empty. There were fewer people than on any given Sunday, and the congregation that trooped out behind the newlyweds was quiet. Everyone had loved Anna. No one wanted to be in the church that day. Clara waited as the congregation filed out. The sound of the footsteps on the hard stone grew distant, and she walked to the front of the church to light a candle. "I won't forget you, ma'am," she said. Chapter 25. June 1913. Alex Watson benefited from the marriage, striking a deal with Bill that meant the Mary Lou was now seaworthy. He displayed a newfound swagger, hollow chest now puffed, holding conversations with Robert in quiet corners. By now, the herring were on their migration from the Scottish Islands, and it was almost time for Jimmy to leave. Only Clara knew of his plans. He would have slunk off unseen, but he was an honourable man, and if he were to start a new life, he must end his old one well. With a deep breath, he knocked on the cottage door. "What?" Rose looked up in surprise as Jimmy walked through the door, the first time he'd crossed the threshold in 6 months. Alex moved to get up from beside the fire, but Rose put a firm hand on his arm and, for once, he complied. Jimmy stayed close enough to the door to make a quick escape should he need to. "I'm leaving to work the herring." Alex didn't even look up. "Good riddance," he said, tossing a piece of wood into the fire. Rose looked up from her knitting and frowned. "You canna go," she said, picking up her needles and resuming her work. "Aye, I can," said Jimmy, unperturbed. "Nay." When she looked up, she had tears in her eyes. "It's not forever," Jimmy lied, hoping this might placate her. "There are the bairns to think about, and your dad's boat," she said, sounding more desperate. "Ma'am, you've not allowed me near the bairns for ages, and Da wants Robert to skipper the Mary Lou. You don't need me here." Rose gave a quick cough to disguise the tears welling in her throat. Her reaction caught Jimmy off guard, and he went across to squeeze her shoulder. She reached up and patted his hand. "When do ye leave?" "Tomorrow," he said, and stepped out onto the quiet island streets. Jimmy had seen Bill heading towards the Crown, so knew Clara would be alone with Rachel and keen to escape a while. He knocked on the cottage door, but it was Rachel who answered. "Is Clara in?" "Aye," she said. "Clara, Jimmy's here." Clara appeared from the bedroom, and Jimmy asked if she fancied a walk. "Aye, I'll fetch my shawl." "How are ye?" he asked Rachel, keen to break the awkward silence that lay between them. "Fine," she said, with none of the joy of a newlywed. Jimmy coughed and shuffled his feet, hoping Clara would appear soon and save him from his awkwardness. "How's Bill?" "Dinna know. He's either on the boat or at the pub." Rachel held his eye, challenging him to press further. Clara appeared and, without acknowledgement, walked past her stepmother into the evening light. "Everything all right?" "Not really. I'm a spare part in that cottage. Da ignores me, and I ignore Rachel, despite her attempts to lord her position over me." "What will ye do?" Clara snapped her head round and gave a hollow laugh. "Not much I can do, is there? We can't all go swanning off when it pleases us." Jimmy said nothing, but thought to himself it was she who wouldn't leave the island. She was making her own bed, as his man would say. "I might get married," Clara said, looking to judge his reaction. Jimmy felt stung, but kept his voice level. "Aye, and who do ye plan to wed?" "I don't know, but there's plenty to choose from," said Clara, flouncing off ahead so that Jimmy had to jog to keep up. When he reached her, he grabbed her arm to stop her.
Clara, he said, avoiding her eyes. It's my last night on the island. Can we not argue? Please? Clara's breath caught at his words. She had long known this moment was coming, but hadn't expected it would come so soon. Let's go to the caves. I've left some things in there I need to fetch before I leave. Without waiting for her answer, he led the way through the village and towards the secret path. Inside the cave, Jimmy moved to the small pile of driftwood he had gathered earlier that day and lit it with a match. Soon, flames were lapping at the wood, casting shadows against the rock walls that danced as Clara moved nearer to him. She sat close, but not so close that they were touching. The cave was quiet, its stillness only broken by the crackling of the fire and the pounding of waves onto the rocks below. It was Clara who broke the silence. I don't want you to go, Jimmy. I know. She sighed in frustration, but didn't take her eyes from the dancing flames. Jimmy spoke again. I don't want to leave you. Aye, you do, she snapped, staring at him hard. I want to leave the island, not ye. It's the same thing, she whispered. He reached across for her hand, but she pulled it away. Her body ached for him to hold her, but if she let him touch her, her resolve would break and she would give him her all. She couldn't let that happen. I'll write, he promised. Clara gave him a weak smile. So will I. Clara looked at him in the firelight, pressing his image into her mind. I should get going, he said, and Clara nodded. Jimmy reached to the back of the cave and picked up his bag of books from their hiding place. He placed a lingering kiss on Clara's cheek and handed her an envelope from his pocket. Read it when I'm gone, he said, before turning his back on her and walking away. Clara stayed in the cave long after he had gone, twirling the envelope round in her fingers and staring at the fire. She thought of the life and the man she could have had. I love you, Jimmy, she said, but only the waves heard her. Clara turned the envelope over in her hands, then tore open the seal and pulled a piece of paper from it. Dearest Clara, I hope one day we can find each other again. All my love, Jimmy. Below it he had written the words of a poem. A fond kiss. A fond kiss and then we sever. A farewell and then forever. Deep in heart-wrung tears I'll pledge thee. Warring sighs and groans I'll wage thee. Who shall say that fortune grieves him, while the star of hope she leaves him? Me, ne'er cheerful twinkle lights me. Dark despair around benights me. I'll ne'er blame my partial fancy. Nathing could resist my Nancy. But to see her was to love her. Love but her, and love forever. Had we never loved sae kindly? Had we never loved sae blindly? Never met, or never parted? We had ne'er been broken-hearted. Fare thee well, thou first and fairest. Fare thee well, thou best and dearest. Thine be ilka joy and treasure, peace, enjoyment, love and pleasure. A fond kiss, and then we sever. A farewell, alas, forever. Deep in heart-wrung tears I'll pledge thee. Warring sighs and groans I'll wage thee. Robert Burns. Jimmy was up before dawn the next morning. He entered the cottage, taking care not to wake his sleeping family. Leaving was harder than he had expected, and as he stared down at his sleeping sisters, he found it difficult to tear himself away. Hair obscured Marnie's face, her small pink mouth just visible. Jimmy placed the lightest of kisses on it, and his heart twisted. He gathered his bag and looked around the cottage for the last time. Wait, came a whisper, and Jimmy saw his mam slip from her bed.
"Wait," she said again, beckoning him to follow as she headed to the yard. When they were out of earshot of the cottage, Jimmy spoke. "Ma'am, I have to go now." I know," she said, flapping her hand to shush him. She disappeared into the privy and came out holding the little tin of shillings. Jimmy shook his head as she held it out towards him. "No, ma'am, ye keep that," he said, pushing her hands away. Rose gave a frustrated sigh. "Jimmy, I've been saving this in the stinking privy for years. I've suffered beatings by your da, hunger and temptation, but I've kept it secret. You're damn well taking it with ye, lad." She thrust it back towards him. Jimmy did something that surprised them both. He flung his arms around his mam. She stood stiffly as he embraced her, but as he drew away, he saw tears swimming in her eyes. "Now ye can gan," she said, handing him the tin before turning away. Jimmy did as he was told and felt a small part of his heart breaking off as he closed the cottage door for the last time. Chapter 26. June 1913. Rag rugs still adorned the stone floor, and Clara still wrapped up in the patchwork quilt each night, but everything else in the cottage had changed. Days merged into one in a blur of chores and strained faces. The members of the household were engaged in a dance of sorts, avoiding each other's company, making excuses to be out of the house, and sitting in different rooms when they were home. Bill had got what he wanted, and Rachel's stomach grew larger with each passing day. She didn't complain about the pregnancy, despite her terrible sickness, and Clara admired her for it. Rachel was meek, quiet, and seemed resigned to the unhappy life she led. There was a mutual apathy between the women. It was a surprise to both when Bill gathered them at the table one evening.
"Clara, we need to have a talk,"
he said, not meeting her eyes. "Aye?"
"I think it would be best if ye made your own way for a while."
"What do you mean, Da?"
"It's plain as day we're near getting along too well together in this house," he said, with rare candour.
"I hope you're not blaming me for that."
"Nah,"
said Bill, looking down at his hands.
"Nah."
"Well then, what do you mean?"
"Things are changing here. There's a barren on the way, a fresh start."
He patted his wife's hand with little enthusiasm.
"I've written your grandparents. They'd be happy for ye to stay with them a while."
"But I've never met them."
"Nah, but they will treat you well. Give ye a better life than this one."
"What about the bairn? What about the work here? You'll need me here to help you." Her voice was rising with panic. Bill shifted in his seat.
"I've arranged for Marnie to stay here. She'll help with the bairn while Rachel attends to the chores."
"You're sending me away?" Clara whispered, a ripple of fear running through her.
"Just for a time. I think it's for the best," said Bill.
"I won't go," Clara shouted. "You can't send me away." Bill looked at her, his face twitching with emotion.
"It's done. You leave next week."
With that, he walked away. Rachel sat picking at grains in the table's wood with her fingernail. "Did you know?" Rachel shook her head, then stood up and followed her husband outside. Over the following days, Clara threw herself into changing Bill's mind, but nothing could break the hard wall of resistance he had erected around him. After 4 days of trying, Clara admitted defeat. Her remaining days on the island were slipping away like grains of sand through a timer, and her soul ached at the thought of leaving her home behind. She took to spending every waking hour walking the island shores, committing its sights and sounds to memory, and filing them away within her heart. She felt her mam walking with her, and whether real or a trick of the mind, her presence gave Clara courage. As dawn broke on her last day, she rose early and walked through the quiet village. In the hidden caves, she settled down to watch the sunrise over a calm sea. She barely noticed the display of colours floating on the water as her mind drifted over her life until this point. The tide was in, and while its waters hugged the island, they could not force her out. but the tide would not hear her pleas, and receded as she knew it would. Rachel had gone to see Rose, and Bill busied himself in the yard as Clara collected the last of her belongings. She wanted to take the patchwork quilt, each square stitched with Anna's love, but it was too heavy. Instead, she slipped the little patchwork rabbit into her bag, a memory of her mam and glorious spring days when she thought happiness would last forever. The rattle of Reverend Barnes's trap approached beyond the window. It was time to leave. "Goodbye, Da," she called, not expecting a reply. She was lifting the catch on the door when Bill appeared in the room. His large body still filled the space, but his essence had shrunk. Clara remembered the days when his laugh rattled through the room, shaking ornaments that now were still. She glanced over her shoulder. "Goodbye." In 2 strides, he had crossed the room, and Clara found herself swamped within his arms. She breathed in his scent as her cheek pressed against his chest, her throat thick with tears. He ran a rough hand across her back, clinging to her, unwilling to let go. I'm sorry, he said with a desperate urgency. Then, in one swift movement, he released her, turning his head so she would not see his tears. "I love you, Clara," he choked, before heading out to the yard. Clara crossed the threshold of her home for the last time. Reverend Barnes reached down with a hand to help her up. Beside him, Clara kept her eyes fixed ahead. She had said goodbye to the island she loved. Now it hurt her to look at it. The vicar was doing a great kindness in driving her, but Clara could not bear to make conversation. Sensing this, he moved the horse along, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. Water glistened on the sands, and the horse ambled along, spraying torrents of water into the air as its muscular legs fought the currents. Midway across, the island's pull overwhelmed Clara, and she turned for one last view of her home. The island squatted against sea and sky, nature's hues of yellow, green and brown, punctuated by the grey stone of dwellings. The sky wrapped around its edges, meeting the sea and slipping into it with reflections of wispy white. Clara closed her eyes and kept them shut until splashes of water gave way to the clacking of hooves on firm ground. For the first time in her life, she reached the mainland.